people say you and I look alike. And so it's kind of quite wonderful to be here on this podcast.
I don't see any resemblance. So,
I'm highly offended. But sorry, anyway, going back to your question. I can't even remember what your question was. What was your question?
The question. Welcome to the 45th episode of Tokyo Alumni Podcast. Today, our guest is a co-founder of MyMizu, an award-winning initiative to reduce consumption of single-use plastics. He is also the co-founder and director of Social Innovation Japan, a platform for social good focusing on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and is a former consultant at the World Bank. He has 10 years experience working with inter-governmental organizations, social enterprises, and NGOs, and has managed humanitarian operations in countries such as Haiti, Nepal, Vanuatu, and Mozambique. In 2017, he took on a sponsored expedition walking 600 plus kilometers along Japan's disaster-affected coastline to document the recovery from the 2011 Fukushima nuclear crisis. He is a board member of the Shibuya QWS Innovation Council and graduated with an MA in International Business from the University of Edinburgh. Welcome to the podcast, Robin.
Thanks so much for having me, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here.
So today we'll talk a bit about MyMizu, your trip walking 600 plus kilometers along the coastlines of Japan, and your various adventures around the world. I'm not sure if we'll be able to cover all of them, but maybe we can talk about at least a few of your expeditions and whatever else comes up. So let's start off with what you're doing right now, MyMizu. Can you tell us a bit about the origin story of how you guys started this NGO, I guess would be the official designation of your group?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for repping MyMizu. For those of you who can see, Nick has a beautiful MyMizu bottle in the background there, so thank you for that. MyMizu, what we do is we're on a mission to tackle the single-use plastic issue. So as you know, you've probably seen lots and lots of news articles and so on, and you've probably seen a lot of waste out there on the oceans and the rivers and the natural environment. And this amount of plastic that we're consuming is currently really quite significant. So what we're doing is we're providing a way for people to shift away from single-use plastic to more sustainable alternatives. What we do is we provide a free smartphone app that connects people to places where they can refill their bottle instead of buying plastic bottles. And currently, we have about 200,000 locations around the world where people can refill their water bottle. And we've built lots of partnerships with local governments, with companies, with schools, universities. And we're really trying to leverage both technology and community to tackle this issue of single-use plastics.
Interesting. So when it comes to water use, it's kind of unique in Japan in the sense that tap water is, consumable, unlike, places like Vietnam, Thailand. So with your sort of initiative in regards to the, free refills, do you find certain locations and demographics are much more sort of susceptible to this model of free refills? And if so, like what areas have really began to sort of absorb this business model of, MyMizu?
To be honest, our main focus right now is Japan. We do have people using our service across some 40 countries. But the reason we're focusing on Japan is because A, we're based here. I'm currently based near Tokyo. But the issue of single-use plastic consumption is not really on the radar, especially compared to, let's say, in parts of Europe or even in the US. So we're kind of trying to bring that whole conversation to a new level. Simultaneously, Japan is the world's second largest consumer of plastic packaging per capita. So we're kind of on the front lines here in terms of plastic consumption, as you've seen on the streets of Tokyo and so on. So right now, to kind of get back to your question, we're really focusing on Japan. In terms of demographic, most of our community and our users and so on tend to be people in their 20s, 30s. But we really have quite a big range of people using the service right now.
And that's really interesting that you mentioned Japan is the second highest per capita with plastic use.
Yeah.
What do you think sort of has pushed Japan to become such a plastic heavy nation when it comes to consumption?
You know, I think traditionally Japan is actually a very environmentally sustainable country. If you look at history, if you look at how people live in harmony with nature throughout the Edo period, even, you know, leading up to the Second World War period and so on. I think where things began to shift, as with many other countries, was with that post-war economic growth, right? We had this rapid growth, and we had a lot of consumerism. Right? That was really when things started to kick off. And there was a famous saying, I think it's shohi wa bitoku. It's like the consumption as a virtue was kind of a significant way of thinking in that period of time. And so I think plastic really kind of hit the mainstream during that period. And while some other countries have started to recognize the negative impacts of plastic and are increasingly introducing regulation and so on, Japan is somewhat still behind. But there's also a lot of action. So we're seeing a lot of shifts within both the private sector, public sector, and so on. But we still have a long way to go.
Interesting. And when it comes to just everyday sort of, reduction of plastic use, or just really any kind of reduction of wasteful, I don't know, I think plastic bags, I guess that's plastic. I'm curious, what is your pitch you give towards especially young people in regards to sort of what they can do? Because I think a lot of the time, as you know, in places like Japan and the US, people are so, I guess, just busy, right? People have their, they got their college exams or whatever. So especially for young people, what's your pitch in regards to what they can do like right away, starting tomorrow?
What I would say with that is that, I mean, I understand, I'm not exactly an angel in terms of my consumption habits. And I definitely use some plastic, and I am not, I can never claim to be 100% like a purist in that sense. What I would say is that I actually think that young people are very much taking the lead on this. If you look at the level of activism, the level of activity within, let's say, Gen Z and the millennial generation, there is a lot of noise and a lot of action. So I actually think there isn't that much convincing to do to those people. But the question is, how do we reach the 80% of people who don't necessarily care? And that's where we're trying to really come in. So rather than taking the environmental, approach, we tend to go more with like the lifestyle approach. So for example, a simple thing like carrying your reusable bottle. If we can make it a positive fashion statement, if we can make it something that people don't do because it's environmentally friendly, but because it's cheaper, it's more convenient, it's whatever it is, having other value is really, I think, how we shift the needle and how we move the conversation forward on this. So that's why we do a lot of events. We do a lot of online communications. We do digital storytelling to really get the story out there in a more positive way, rather than seeing it as a negative, we have to save the oceans and we have to sacrifice our lives or our lifestyles. Why don't we shift the conversation to, hey, look, guys, we can create this fantastic society. We can make new value with the way that we live, and we can live in an environmentally friendly way as well. So we're trying to kind of stay away from the negative messaging and kind of more pull with our digital content, with our storytelling, and so on.
Yeah, that's a great point. That it's hard to convince people, right? And as you said earlier, I guess the young people are the ones that I guess you're saying don't need the convincing. But with the older people, then there's kind of been the economic approach, or I guess how do you sort of try to make the economic argument of buying the reusable bottles?
So I think that we're seeing a fundamental shift in society. I think businesses, let's take the business sector first, right? Businesses are shifting not necessarily just because of consumer demand. Yes, there are some increasing voices and concerns among consumers about plastic packaging and negative environmental impact. But I think where we see a lot of promise is that now investors are saying, hey, unless you guys get your what they call ESG, environment, society, governance, factors aligned, then we're not going to invest in you. And then the employees are increasingly saying, hey, look, unless you make a positive impact on society, I'm not going to work for you. So yes, consumers are changing the story, but on top of that, we have investors, we have employees, we have lots of different stakeholders now, all shifting in the same direction, away from carbon intensive and environmentally damaging activity. So I think, yes, consumers are important, but we're seeing so many different factors in play, including also government regulation. There is more regulation clamping down on this. So hopefully this will be like the momentum change that we need to get this off the ground.
Interesting. And it's, a lot of the work you do is obviously, it's not about you. You're always sort of working for other people and trying to make the world a better place. But I want to focus now on you. Robin Lewis,
okay.
Man. And
I should say that I think, I'm kind of lucky in that I do what I really enjoy doing. And it just so happens to be environmental work or whatever it is. So I never really approach my work like I'm sacrificing myself for this cause. I just genuinely enjoy doing certain things that happen to align with, I guess, broadly defined social impact. But anyway, sorry for interrupting there.
Well, it's a good point. I don't know. I still see it very much as a sacrifice you're making for other people. But when we look at you as a person, you came to Japan at age 15, right? So in that sense, 14, and in that sense, you weren't really quote unquote raised in Japan, right? You spent 3-4 years of high school. And then you left to the UK, and then you decided to return though. And I wanted to ask you, why come back to Japan? Basically, what was the attractiveness of going back to Tokyo? And was there any point when you graduated from Edinburgh that you were just like, all right, you spent most of your life until then in the UK? What pushed you towards heading back to Tokyo?
So I should say I was actually born here in Tokyo, but then I left pretty soon after. I think I was 2 or 3 years old when I left. So I don't really have any kind of super early memories of Japan. I did come back for a short stint when I was, I think, 10 or 11. My memory is getting terrible. I forget all the details, but I was back once when I was around 10 years old as well. But kind of going back to the question, what really brought me back to Japan, I'll give you the super short version of this story, but I was studying business at university in Scotland. And I just remember, I always say that studying business made me very skeptical of modern day business, because all of the conversation was about profit maximization, about how to maximize shareholder value, right? And there was no conversation around how does business affect society in a positive way. And so that really kind of disheartened me. I thought, well, if the corporate sector is just about, making loads of money, what's the point? Like, what are we making money for, right? And so I was kind of having this career crisis just as I was graduating, and all of my friends were heading to like top, business firms and whatnot. And then one day, the 2011 tsunami happened, and that was right before I was going to graduate. So I still remember, I was in bed and my phone was ringing, and I picked up, and it was my mum, and she said, "Hey, Robin, there's been a big earthquake." So I remember switching on the TV and seeing this horrific scene, unfolding. So actually, what brought me back to Japan initially was the tsunami, and that turned out to be a very big moment in terms of my career and my journey as well.
So when you say the tsunami brought you back, can you elaborate on that point? What do you mean? Like, you wanted to join like rescue missions, or what exactly about the tsunami brought you back?
Sure. My mum's family originally is from Sendai, from Miyagi, which was devastated by the tsunami. So there was some kind of ancestral connection. And when I saw that, I had a strong urge to do something, right? I mean, I was a student coming from a privileged background. When somewhere where I consider my home is in need, then surely I should do something. So I had quite a strong urge to do something, and that's what brought me back. What happened then was kind of crazy when I think about it. I ended up essentially just volunteering. I didn't have any skills. I didn't have any experience with any of this stuff. But I ended up volunteering in Fukushima and Miyagi and Iwate, where I was helping out in the emergency centers and coordinating international teams as a volunteer. And it was a really kind of meaningful experience. I thought, this is the kind of work that I would love to do. You can see the impact, you meet amazing people. And yes, it's very difficult times, but you can see a very clear impact of your work. So that's when I thought, cool, imagine if I could do this for a job. And eventually it did become my job.
Wow. So it's just all these events connected to one another. The earthquake happening right as you graduated.
Yeah. It's kind of it's kind of crazy when you think about it. Yeah, I've now been working for 10 years and everything has just been complete, I guess, spontaneity, timing that's led me here so far.
Wow. And then you stay in Japan and there's a major sponsored expedition you go on in 2013, right? It's roughly, 2 years after?
No, that was 2016. So that was a fair bit after. About 5 years after.
Sorry, my notes are wrong. I think you gave me those notes, though.
No. You just weren't listening to my call, man. That's all you.
So 2016, you go on this expedition, right? 600 plus kilometers. Can you tell us a bit about how that transpired in the first place? And, since then, my understanding is it's sort of become like a tourist, like a tourist thing, basically. It wasn't a thing, and now it is a thing. So can you sort of explain how it came to fruition?
Okay, so just to fill in the gap a bit, between 2011 and 2016, I was working in the humanitarian space. So I ended up getting a job with an NGO where I was in charge of humanitarian projects. So essentially, I would go into areas that were affected by mainly natural disasters like typhoons and floods and this kind of thing, and basically work with local government, work with UN organizations to essentially provide humanitarian assistance. So that was kind of that bulk of that 5 years. But Tohoku, as I mentioned before, the earthquake in 2011 was a really significant part of this story. So I was always drawn back, I wanted to go back and kind of understand what had happened in those 5 years since the tsunami. So I decided to do this walk because the government had just opened this new trail along the coastline that had been devastated by the tsunami. And when I read about this, I was like, okay, I love doing like outdoorsy kind of adventure stuff. And it's in the area that was affected by the tsunami. So I thought, two things that are super connected to me, let's do this. And so I got some sponsorship and some grants and things, and I did this kind of mini adventure down the coastline. And the whole point of this was to essentially tell the stories of people who had been affected by the tsunami, how they're rebuilding their lives, and also to promote the area as a tourist destination, because tourism is such a powerful way to help communities recover from disaster.
All right, so enough about Robin Lewis, the human. And I want to get back to sort of Robin Lewis, the worldwide globetrotter, rescue, whatever you do.
Okay.
You see all these places, right? Mozambique, Vanuatu, and with those various, these various places you've been to in regards to, responding to crisis. Which one has been the most challenging, and why was that the most challenging place to go?
Well, that's a great question. I don't think anyone's asked me that before. Honestly, I mean, these are all emergency kind of humanitarian projects, and I should clarify that they're relatively short term. Up to a few months. It's not like I was living there for a long period of time, but it's always complicated. I mean, if I had to pick one. I was actually in Nepal during there were two major earthquakes in 2015. I was in Kathmandu, the capital, during the massive aftershock, and I think that was about magnitude 7 or something. And I remember being terrified because I was in Kathmandu, which has lots of like tall kind of, old looking buildings. And I remember people like kind of panicking, running around. And I thought, okay, if this falls on me, this is the end. That was a pretty challenging situation. But honestly, all of them have been challenging in different ways.
And when it comes to, you mentioned earlier sort of the connection of business, I think a common question people would have, especially, in your area of just basic environmentalism. I know we had a guest a few seasons ago, Ian, who I believe you guys are been acquainted.
Yeah.
Graduate of St. Mary's is, I know sometimes that people don't want to talk about money, but I think it's a conversation worth having. Is how do if someone is aspiring to work in that sector of conservationism, environmentalism, basically how do you put food on your plate? How can one pursue that cause yet create a living for themselves?
That's a great point. So what I would say there is that when I was young, I say that like I'm an old man, when I was younger at university, there were two parts, right? Either one, you do good for the world. You go work for an NGO, maybe the UN, maybe government, or you go and make money, right? You go work for Mitsubishi, you go do whatever, Goldman Sachs, McKinsey, whatever. But what is emerging, and what has been emerging for the past 10 years or longer, in fact, is this middle route where you can make money, you can have profit, and you can also solve serious social and environmental problems. So as MyMizu right now, we consider ourselves more of a social business as opposed to an NGO. What that means is we pursue both profit and purpose, right? As you say, unless we have money, we can't pay our salaries, we can't pay the rent, and then we shut down. So we find ways to make money. We have our business models to essentially ensure that we can continue doing the work that we're doing and hopefully scale up as well. So we do have a team of full-time staff, part-time staff, and so on. And in that sense, I strongly believe that through the power of business, you can solve social problems and do good things, whether it's environmentalism or human rights or whatever as well.
So I recall, I think it's Tom's Shoes. Is that the one where, you buy shoes, they give one away? And obviously you're in this, you have much more know-how in that area. What are a few companies that you would look at as sort of being in the forefront right now in regards to making that money, right? Obviously Tom's is just, seems like every other person I know has one, yet contributing greatly in regards to, social responsibility.
That's a good question. I mean, there are a lot of startups and kind of smaller ventures working on.
Minus MyMizu. Okay.
I would highly recommend MyMizu. No. There's a whole bunch of really solid examples of this in the business world. What's really interesting is there are now big brands, like major companies, who are aligning all of their activities with social and environmental issues. So you may have heard of what's called a B Corp, which is essentially a company that is legally, or that there is a very stringent checklist to ensure that the company is doing really good things with their supply chain, with their carbon emissions and so on. There are some big companies who are currently becoming B Corp voluntarily because they understand that the consumer wants responsible items and responsible products. So just to name a few examples, I believe, companies even like Unilever and Procter & Gamble, they definitely had, I'm sure, a lot of negative impacts traditionally, but in recent years, they've really been taking the lead in terms of sustainable development and so on. In terms of other, one startup that I like is called Indosol. And I'm just saying this because I have these flip-flops very close to me. But basically, they're flip-flops made of tires that have been disposed of in Bali. And they hire local artisans to essentially make flip-flops from these waste tires and so on. So that's an example of just one kind of social business that solves or tackles a social and environmental problem while also making profits.
Amazing.
It's called Indosol. It's a good company. Yeah.
I like put a little link in the.
Man, that's cool.
That's intriguing, and it's a Tokyo Alumni podcast. So we were actually in high school at the same time. Class of 2006 and 2005. were there any, parts throughout your academic / professional journey that could be traced back to ASIJ?
Yeah. Sorry, just as you were saying that, I had a flashback. I think on my second day at ASIJ, I dropped my student card. And no, hang on. No. Let me start again.
No.
Someone came up to me, and I vividly remember this, in the library, right? And they said, hey, dude, I don't know who you are, but I think you've dropped your student card. And they gave me the card, and it was you. So apparently people kept thinking they were alike. And I've had so many variations of this episode where people say you and I look alike. And so it's kind of quite wonderful to be here on this podcast.
I don't see any resemblance. So,
I'm highly offended. But sorry, anyway, going back to your question. I can't even remember what your question was. What was your question?
The question was, so throughout your, academic / professional, career, are there any major points that you feel like trace back to your 3 years at ASIJ? Oh yeah.
Well, first of all, I was there for 2 years. I think if you'd been listening to my my previous show, I was there for 2 years, junior and senior.
Was that it? Maybe it felt longer. It felt longer.
Yeah, it was torture. It was torture for you, clearly. But essentially, yeah, in terms of what I brought away from ASIJ, I think there are so many things, and I guess it's like with so many things where you only really realize once you get to not a certain age, but once you have some time away from ASIJ. I did meet a lot of really lovely people who I'm still in touch with to this day. I think the school did instill a sense of kind of global citizenship or responsibility upon me as well. Even though I wasn't very active, kind of ironically, I never really did anything very responsible or very, philanthropic or anything at ASIJ. I was too busy doing sports and other stuff. But no, I'd say, just that sense of global citizenship, if that's the term, and also just having that broader perspective that we're super fortunate to have at ASIJ.
Interesting. So you mentioned that you weren't part of any of those, I think it was a Habitat for Humanity and all those.
Yeah. I think I applied, but I think I got rejected. The same thing at university. I applied to something, people just kept rejecting me. So I thought, well, okay, I've got to do this as my career now, just to prove I can make it.
Yeah, you just have to walk 600 kilometers, and they're gonna have to take you seriously. Huh? Oh, that's intriguing. Yeah, that's good to hear, though. That the whole global mindset. I mean, it's very easy. I think there's literally thousands of schools that promulgate this.
Yeah,
they have this big idea of making global citizens, but so much of it's on websites, and that's it. That's where it stops. It's where it starts and ends. But it seems like for the most part, ASIJ does a pretty decent job at instilling that sense of global responsibility. Just seeing these various guests on so not just ASIJ, but St. Mary's and St. Maur and.
But what's been cool is that I've gone back to ASIJ recently since starting MyMizu, and I actually have some of the students helping us out and stuff. So there's clearly a lot of not just interest from the school, but also a lot of the students who want to do something positive for society and the environment. So it's a really promising sign to see that ASIJ is doing a lot of this stuff strategically now as well.
That's really good to hear, because I felt like that was one thing that was lacking when I was there as a student and even when I graduated, was you see schools like St. Mary's, and they have very much a system of like mentorship and people, getting internships, etc. Whereas at ASIJ, it seems like that's always been lacking, which is why actually I think they recently have a full-time position now of like alumni associations or alumni relationships. So, it's good to see that they're starting to catch up, to these other international schools that seem to already have the pipelines, set up. But
Can I ask you the same question?
Yeah.
Am I allowed to ask you questions?
Definitely, yeah.
What did you take away most from ASIJ that's contributed to your career?
Wow.
The tables have turned.
I know, it's so hard, right? Answering questions is much harder.
I asked you a question on your podcast like this.
I think there's been a few. Depends on the guest. There's some guests that ask 2-3 questions, but most not really.
Okay. I just had to be difficult.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting question. I want to say, I mean, for me, international education is everything, right? I've been in the international school system since age 3 until 18, and then apart from 4 years of college and a year of working, I went right back into the system. So, I think it's everything in both good and the bad. I feel like because I've been part of the system for so long, even though I'm only 34, so minus 4 years of college and a year of working, I've been 29 years, either a student or a teacher, right, in the system. So I feel like I see the positives, as you mentioned, like global mindset. There's a lot of good that comes out of international schools, but I also feel like I'm kind of on a crusade, or at least I feel like I'm on a crusade constantly trying to make international schools better. Because I feel like I see the blind spots, right? I really see the blind spots, especially because I know the perspective, even parents, right? Often teachers don't have, even the teachers who are parents don't talk to other parents. So I feel like they're lacking that perspective. But I feel like myself, like talking to your parents or, which is quite limited, but other parents, that generally that has given me a lot more perspective in regards to what parents are thinking, what basically these various stakeholders are thinking. Whereas I think in a standard international school, the teachers are just teachers, right? They don't have the view of what students have. They don't have the view of what parents have. So I feel like, I feel like that would be my biggest influence of ASIJ, is that it's given me that perspective. And I try to leverage that perspective in my teaching and try to make my teaching better, at least not bad, I guess, is my goal.
That's really interesting. No, I would like to follow up with some other questions, but I will stand down on this one. So please continue.
Lovely. So we've talked a bit about your work. We've talked a bit about you, the man, and Tokyo Alumni. So ASIJ stuff, and I want to wrap it up with what is coming up in your life. I know COVID is around, so this question's been very loaded for a lot of people, but even with COVID in mind, what do you see yourself doing a year from now, 10 years from now?
That's a great question. And I guess, I've tried to take some time in this past 6 months since COVID began to think about that in a bit more detail. I think, to be honest, in the next year, I'll continue to work on MyMizu, and we're hoping to expand more and more as the as the COVID crisis continues. In terms of 5-10 years time, that's a great question. I think where I see myself is potentially working in education at some point. I never thought that I would be interested in education, but the more I work with young people, whether it's university students or high schools or whatever, the more I see that is a really fulfilling and really exciting opportunity. So don't quote me on this, but I may consider maybe working in education in some way going forward. But to be honest, I think the most likely outcome will be that I'll continue doing kind of social entrepreneurship, running a business, whatever it is. I think once you're kind of living this kind of job, once you have this kind of setup, it's really hard to go back to anything else. So I think I'm completely A, unmanageable, and B, probably unhireable at this point because I've been doing so many weird things. So I think I have no other choice than just to continue doing this kind of weird, crazy stuff and, surviving.
So surviving and doing weird, crazy stuff. That sounds like a good...
That's my motto, yeah.
And you said don't quote me on it, but sorry, I guess I did quote you on it a little bit there.
You did. You did. Damn it.
So that pretty much concludes episode 45. Thank you for being on this podcast, and we'll see you around, Robin. And MyMizu, check out the link in the YouTube thingy. They have cool bottles and stuff. And please continue to save the world, Robin. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. I'm a massive fan of your work, and I'm looking forward to the episodes coming up. Thanks so much for having me.